I married my sister's fiance 3 days after her accident, wearing a dress that had been altered for her body, not mine. Everyone in the county called Weston Calloway impossible to live with. Then he spoke his first sentence to me as my husband, and a number floated over his head that no one else could see. Gentle. 91%. It stayed there 3 full seconds before it faded, the way breath fades off a cold window. I told myself I was exhausted. Nobody sleeps well the night before they marry a stranger to save their family's barn. 6 hours earlier, my sister Regan had been lying on the stable floor with her collarbone in 2 pieces, insisting through gritted teeth that the wedding still happen, that somebody had to stand in that dress, that the bishops did not miss deadlines the Calloways set for them. She said it like a business memo. She said it like she believed it. Nobody looked at me when they decided it would be me. That's not entirely true. My mother looked at me exactly once, the way you look at a spare tire you're grateful exists but never wanted to need. You're the practical one, Diane Bishop said, already reaching for the veil. You'll manage. I want to be clear about something before I go any further. I did not fall in love with Weston Calloway, because he turned out to be kind underneath a reputation built to keep people out. I fell in love with him slowly, the way you fall into a habit you didn't choose but can't imagine your life without. But that morning, standing in a dress with someone else's hempin still marking where it used to end, I only knew 3 things. My sister was hurt. My family owed the Calloways more money than a bookkeeper's daughter likes to say out loud. And somewhere past the receiving line, a man everyone in 3 counties called unbearable was waiting to marry whichever bishop daughter showed up. I was the one who showed up. I should tell you how we got here because none of it was sudden, even if it felt that way standing at that altar. My great-grandmother started Bishop Stables with 11 acres and a mare nobody else wanted. She swore she could read a horse's whole heart in 30 seconds flat, and people humored her until she was right often enough that they stopped calling it luck. 4 generations later, we still kept her strangest habit alive, a leather ledger 1 line per horse recording not bloodlines but moods, hates the color orange, only settles for left-handed riders, cries every time it storms. My father used to say we're the only farm in Kentucky that ran on feelings instead of pedigree charts, and he said it like something to be proud of. I kept my own version of that ledger, smaller, spiral-bound, tucked in my back pocket most days. People assumed it was for the horses. Half the time it was for the people. Around town, folks talked about the Calloways the way you'd talk about a corporation, rarely bothering to specify which one actually owned anything. Most assumed that was Harlan, the elder of the 2 Calloway brothers still living, since he was the one who showed up in the society pages. Weston just trained the horses, hands in the dirt every morning before sunrise. Nobody thought to ask what that actually made him. Our 2 families had been tied together since before I was born, back when my grandfather and Weston's grandfather built a fence line together and shook on more than either of them ever put on paper. When my father needed capital to save our barn from a bad winter and a worse loan, it was the Calloways who carried us, quietly, on a handshake dressed up afterward as a contract. My father died 2 years ago, heart not debt, though I think the debt helped it along. He left behind a folder none of us wanted to read closely enough to understand until it mattered. Inside it was a single page, typed decades earlier, a marriage clause, meant to fold the bishop training operation into Calloway Farms for good, sealing 40 years of handshakes into something a bad season couldn't undo. It didn't name Regan. I want that on the record, because for 2 years everyone acted like it did, my mother included. It said, a daughter of the Bishop family. My father wrote it that way on purpose. I found his note folded inside that same folder only weeks before the wedding, in handwriting I hadn't seen in 2 years. Whichever one of my girls has the sense to see Paston's reputation deserves the man underneath it. I have a feeling I know which one that'll be. I hadn't shown it to anyone. I still don't know why I brought it with me that morning, folded small enough to fit under a hairpin, but I did. Weston Calloway did not smile at his own wedding. He stood at the front of a chapel that had belonged to his family long before it belonged to either of us, in a suit that fit like it had been sewn on, jaw set so hard I understood, instantly, why half the county called him difficult. He watched me walk toward him with an expression I couldn't read, and for one terrible second I thought, this is a man furious that his bride broke her collarbone and sent her sister instead. Then I got close enough to see his hands, they were shaking. Nobody tells you that about impossible men, nobody mentions the shaking. The ceremony took 11 minutes. I know because I counted, the way you count things when you need somewhere safe to put your attention. When it came time for his vow, his voice dropped low enough that only I could hear it, which I'd learned was exactly how he said anything that mattered. I know you didn't choose this, he said. I intend to make sure you don't regret it. That's when it happened. A shape bloomed in the air above his head, pale and lit from nowhere, gone before I could process it. 2 words and a number. Gentle, 91%. I looked over my shoulder to see if anyone else had flinched. Nobody had. The officiant kept talking. My mother kept dabbing at eyes that, as far as I could tell, were completely dry. I decided right there that I hadn't slept enough in 4 days to trust my own eyes. I put it away in the part of my mind reserved for things I wasn't ready to look at directly. I would take it back out 14 more times before the week was over, and every time, the number would read the same. Gentle, 91%, like a pulse, like something that couldn't lie even if the man attached to it wanted it to. I met Grant Calloway 40 minutes later, holding 2 glasses of champagne he clearly meant to make into a bit. The understudy, he said, handing one over anyway, warm as anything, a smile that had been aimed at cameras before it was ever aimed at me. Nobody told me the swap came with an upgrade. I laughed, because that's what you do, because it sounded like a compliment wrapped around a joke wrapped around nothing at all. Above his head, the same pale shape bloomed that had appeared over Weston's. Calculating, 88%. I nearly dropped the champagne. Careful, Grant said, leaning in like we were already old friends, nodding toward his cousin across the room. Weston has a way of making people disappear once he's finished needing them. Ask anyone who used to work here. I would spend the next 4 months believing that was a joke about a temper. I was wrong about whose sentence it actually described. At the time, I only smiled the smile you learn young in a family like mine, the one that costs nothing and commits you to nothing, and excused myself toward the one person in the room I already, inexplicably, trusted more than my own mother. Weston found me by the door 20 minutes later, 2 glasses of water instead of champagne, like he'd clocked exactly how the night was landing on me without needing to be told. You don't have to perform for them, he said, quiet, just for me. Not tonight, not ever, if I have anything to say about it. I didn't see a number that time, I didn't need one, some things you just feel land true. Somewhere in the receiving line, Weston's aunt, a silver-haired woman named Constance who hadn't said one word to me all evening, watched Grant walk away from us with an expression so unreadable I filed it next to the shaking hands and the ledger note, in the growing folder of things about this family I didn't understand yet. I had 4 months before the Ashwood Cup, the farm's biggest race of the year, and with it, the day the marriage clause would either hold for good or dissolve. 4 months to learn a man everyone called impossible. I didn't know yet that I also had 4 months to save him. Calloway Farms didn't feel like a house so much as an institution that happened to have bedrooms. I moved my ledger and 4 boxes of clothes into a wing bigger than my mother's entire house, and spent the first week getting lost on my way to breakfast. Weston found me twice in the east hallway, both times without comment, both times just quietly walking me back like rescuing his wife from her own home was the most ordinary thing in the world. Town gossip had prepared me for a man who barked at grooms and fired people for showing up 2 minutes late. What I actually got was a man who woke at 4:40 every morning to work the horses himself, no assistant standing between him and the animals. Because he told me once, half embarrassed to admit it, he didn't trust anyone else to notice the small things in time. I found out what he meant with a gelding named Ranger. Ranger had come off a track 2 states over, the kind of horse nobody expects to recover from what happened to him there. He flinched at raised voices. He flinched at fast movement. He'd flinch, I'd learn, at the particular creak of one gate hinge that reminded him of something none of us would ever fully know. I watched Weston sit on an overturned bucket for 45 minutes one morning, not touching Ranger, not talking, just existing quietly in the same 6 feet of space until the horse's ears finally came forward instead of pinned back. People think gentle is the same as soft, he said, not looking at me, like he'd known I was standing in the doorway the whole time. It's not. Soft breaks. Gentle is what's left when you've decided not to. I wrote that down that night, word for word, in the section of my ledger I used to reserve for horses. 91%, I thought. For once, the number felt like it was catching up to the man instead of the other way around. The farm hosted an open house every spring for buyers, press, and the kind of old Kentucky families who measured friendship in fence lines. My first appearance as Weston's wife happened there, 4 weeks into the marriage, in a blue dress my mother approved of more than she'd approved of anything about me in years. Grant made sure I understood the stakes before I'd finished my first glass of lemonade. "You know about the trust, don't you?" he said, steering me toward a quiet corner with a hand at my elbow I hadn't invited. "My grandfather wrote it strange, God rest him. Weston runs this whole operation outright, no board, no oversight. The second he stayed married through the Ashwood Cup this fall. Until then my father and my aunt and I still have a say. A meaningful one." He smiled the camera-ready smile from the wedding. "Shame if something unsettled things before then. Marriages are fragile in the first year, especially the sudden kind." "We'll manage," I said, borrowing my mother's phrase without meaning to. "Of course you will," Grant said. "You're the practical one. Everybody says so." It took me a full minute to place why that landed like a slap instead of a compliment. He'd used my mother's exact words. I never told him what she'd called me on my wedding morning. Someone had. Across the lawn, Weston was mid-conversation with an older buyer, laughing at something, an easy, unguarded laugh I'd only seen him use around horses until that moment. Grant followed my eyes. "He's better with you than I expected," he said, and for 1 second the smile actually reached his eyes, which somehow scared me more than the version that didn't, careful not to get used to it before the fall. I didn't understand yet what he meant. I understood the number floating over his head though, the one that hadn't changed once in 4 weeks. Calculating 88%. I started keeping a page in my ledger just for him. I offered to help reconcile the farm's books in my second month, mostly because I didn't know how else to be useful in a house that ran itself, and because bookkeeping was the one thing about me nobody in my family had ever needed to be told twice. Weston handed the accounts over without hesitation, which I'd later understand was its own kind of statement. Grant, when he heard, laughed and called it adorable, which was its own kind of statement too. The books were clean. Almost suspiciously clean, the way a house is suspiciously clean right before someone tells you they're selling it. I found the first thing wrong 3 weeks in, going through 5 years of invoices. A vendor called Bluegrass Equine Logistics paid a small, forgettable amount 6 times a year for supplemental feed transport. Forgettable except that the company didn't come up in any state registry I checked, and the payments always cleared 2 days before a big race, every time, going back 3 years. I didn't say anything to Weston yet. I told myself I wanted to be sure before handing him one more worry, which was true but not the whole truth. The whole truth was I already had a bad feeling about whose name I'd find if I pulled the thread far enough, and I wasn't ready to be right. I wrote one line at the top of Grant's page that night, the first thing there that wasn't a mood or a number. Find out who signs for Bluegrass Equine Logistics. Reagan came to see me in my 3rd month, collarbone healed, pride still healing slower. We sat on the back porch with sweet tea neither of us drank, watching Ranger graze at a safe distance from the fence like he still wasn't sure the world had stopped being dangerous. "I keep waiting for you to hate me," she said, after 20 minutes of small talk about nothing. "I let you walk into my wedding. I told Mom to send you. You had a broken collarbone, you didn't have a lot of options. I had the option to say no. I didn't take it." She turned her glass in slow circles, watching the condensation instead of me. "I was relieved. I need you to know that, even if it makes me terrible." I was lying on that stable floor in more pain than I'd ever been in, and underneath it, I felt relieved, because it meant I didn't have to marry a man everyone said would make my life small. I let you take that instead. I've hated myself for it every day since. I thought about telling her the truth, that the man everyone described didn't match the one who'd sat on a bucket for 45 minutes not touching a traumatized horse until it trusted him. I decided some things were mine to know before they were anyone else's to hear. "He's not what they said," I told her instead. "Not even close." Reagan looked at me a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes. "Mom's going to be furious you actually fell for him. That wasn't part of the arrangement." Mom's furious about something most days. I've stopped organizing my life around fixing that. It was the first time I'd said something like that out loud. Reagan smiled, small and real, the first one I'd seen from her since before our father died. "Good," she said. "It's about time one of us did." My mother's version of a visit came 2 weeks later, unannounced, with an agenda she didn't bother disguising. "You've let yourself get comfortable," Diane said, standing in the doorway of a kitchen 4 times the size of ours, pricing the whole room with her eyes. "That's not what this arrangement was for. It was for the barn. It was for the family. It was never meant to turn into, she waved a hand at the general shape of my life, this. Into a marriage? Into a girl who thinks she's earned a seat at a table like this one. She said it lightly, which somehow made it land harder. You were always the practical one. It's not like you had someone else waiting for you back home. Don't mistake gratitude on his part for something it isn't. I want to tell you I had a perfect, cutting response ready. I didn't. I stood in a kitchen that wasn't mine yet, holding a coffee cup that was, and felt 14 years old again, felt every dinner where Reagan got the good news and I got the responsible task. Then I thought about a note folded small enough to fit under a hairpin. Whichever one of my girls has the sense to see past Weston's reputation deserves the man underneath it. Dad thought I could see something you can't, I said, quiet, steady, surprising myself. I'm starting to think he was right. My mother didn't have anything to say to that. She left 20 minutes later, and for the first time in my life, I didn't walk her to the car. Weston found me on the porch steps an hour after she'd gone, Ranger grazing his careful distance, the sky doing something orange and complicated over the west pasture. He didn't ask what happened. He just sat down close enough that our shoulders touched, and stayed there until the sky finished. For what it's worth, he said eventually, I think your father had excellent taste in daughters. I learned the real story behind Weston's reputation on a Tuesday in July, sitting in the tack room while he cleaned a brittle he didn't need to clean, the way he did most things he could have handed off. My father died when I was 26, he said, not looking up. Heart attack in this exact barn, on a morning I'd overslept and wasn't here for. I decided after that I wasn't going to oversleep anything else that mattered. People mistook that for coldness. It's easier to let them think that than explain it. That's not cold, I said. That's grief wearing a work shirt. He looked up at that, something moving across his face I hadn't seen before, almost startled, like nobody had described it back to him accurately in a long time. Grant used to be different, he added, quieter. We were close, growing up. Something changed around the time his father started telling him what he was owed instead of what he'd earned. I've spent 3 years hoping I was wrong about how much. I thought about bluegrass equine logistics. I thought about one unanswered line at the top of a page. I almost told him right there. I didn't, not yet, because I still didn't have enough to hand him, only enough to worry him, and I'd promised myself I wouldn't do that until I could also hand him a way out. Instead, I told him about the ledger. All of it, the real reason, 4 generations of women writing down feelings instead of pedigrees. I showed him the page with his name at the top, 3 months of the same 2 words written over and over. Gentle 91%. He read it twice. When he looked up, his hands were shaking again the same way they had at the altar. Nobody's kept a ledger on me before, he said. Not one I'd want read anyway. Get used to it, I said. I intend to keep this one a long time. It was the closest either of us had come to saying the word neither of us had used yet. We didn't say it that night either. But I felt it land true, the way I'd learned to trust things landing, number or no number. August brought the first real attack, and it didn't come at me directly. It came sideways, the way Grant did everything. A reporter from a regional racing outlet called asking for comment on questions about the legitimacy of the Calloway marriage, phrasing close enough to Grant's own to have his fingerprints on it, without his name anywhere in sight. The story that ran 3 days later never used the word fraud outright. It didn't have to. It used words like sudden and convenient and timed suspiciously close to a multi-million-dollar trust provision, and let readers finish the sentence. Harlan Calloway called an emergency meeting of the trust's 3 overseeing family members. I wasn't invited, which told me everything about how seriously they were taking the story. Weston came out of that meeting with his jaw doing the thing it had done at our wedding. Constance didn't say a word in my defense, he told me afterward, pacing our bedroom like the walls had personally wronged him. Not one word the whole meeting. She just sat there and let Harlan talk about optics like our marriage is a stock he's worried about. I thought about the unreadable look Constance had given Grant at our wedding, the one I'd filed away without understanding. I didn't have an explanation for her silence now either, and the not knowing sat wrong in my chest for days. I tried to see her reading, the way I had everyone else's, and got nothing at all. No number. No word. Just a blank space where Grant's calculating and Weston's gentle had always bloomed instantly. I told myself the ability must have limits. I didn't like what it meant that hers was one of them. Maybe she agrees with him, I said before I could stop myself. Weston didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence sat between us for the rest of the night, the first real distance either of us had let open since the wedding. I found the girth strap by accident, doing tack inventory the way I did most Sunday afternoons now, keeping my hands busy because that was the only thing that quieted the noise in my head since the article ran. It was in a bin marked damaged, waiting on a repair that never seemed to get scheduled. I almost didn't look twice, then I turned it over. I'd spent 19 years around tack before I ever touched a ledger book. I know what a strap looks like when it wears through naturally, fibers frayed soft and gradual, giving up slowly over years of honest use. This wasn't that. This was a clean diagonal cut, 3/4 through, left just enough intact to hold under light pressure and fail completely under the sudden weight of a rider mounting up. The tag on the bin, faded but legible, listed the date. It was Reagan's saddle. From the morning of the accident that put her on that stable floor and put me in her wedding dress 3 days later. I sat down hard on an overturned bucket, the same kind Weston used with Ranger, and stayed there a long time. Everyone had called it bad luck. A worn strap, unfortunate timing. I'd called it that too when I thought about it all, which wasn't often, because grief and gratitude had used up most of the space I had for questions that spring. Nobody cuts a strap by accident. Somebody had wanted Reagan off that horse, hard enough to risk real injury, close enough to the wedding that the timing couldn't have been a coincidence by any generous reading. I thought about a man at a reception 4 months ago, warm champagne in his hand, telling me his cousin had a way of making people disappear once he'd finished needing them. I hadn't misheard the sentence, I just aimed it at the wrong cousin. I photographed the strap from 4 angles before I put it back exactly where I found it, and for the first time since my wedding day, the ledger in my back pocket felt less like a family habit and more like evidence. Earl Whitaker had worked the Callaway barns for 31 years, long enough to remember Weston as a kid who used to fall asleep in the hay loft waiting for foals to be born. He found me in the equipment shed 2 days after I found the strap, standing close enough to keep his voice down. Grant asked Tommy Reyes to meet him behind the west barn tonight, 9 o'clock, alone, Earl said. Tommy's been jumpy all week, won't say why. I don't like the shape of it. I didn't like the shape of it either. Tommy was young, 22 maybe, the kind of quiet that comes from needing a job more than you need to ask questions about it. I told myself I was only going to listen. I didn't plan what I'd do if listening turned into something worse. The west barn sat far enough from the house that voices carried strange in the dark, bouncing off the hillside behind it. I got close enough to make out shapes, not close enough to be seen, and heard enough to understand why Tommy's hands were shaking harder than any horse's ever had. You're going to tell them you saw Weston lose his temper with a client, Grant was saying, easy, almost bored, like he was ordering dinner. You're going to tell them you're scared to work here. You're going to do it because I know exactly how you got that gash on Comet's leg last spring, and exactly how much it would cost you if the insurance company found out it wasn't an accident. That's not, Tommy's voice cracked. You told me it was for the horse's own good. You said the vet needed a reason to. I said a lot of things, Grant said. You did what you did. That doesn't change because you don't like what I'm asking for now. I stood behind a stack of hay bales, one hand pressed flat against my own sternum like I could hold my heart in place by force, and understood completely that I wasn't looking at a man with a temper problem. I was looking at a man who'd spent years building a machine out of other people's fear, and Weston's reputation was only the most visible gear in it. I didn't confront him that night. I went home and sat at the kitchen table until Weston found me there at midnight, and for the first time in 5 months I told him everything. Weston wanted to confront Grant that same night. I talked him out of it, which took longer than I expected from a man who'd spent 5 months teaching me that gentle wasn't the same as soft. If we go at him directly, he denies everything and spends the next 4 months making sure nothing sticks. I said, we have a photograph of a cut strap and one terrified 22-year-old. That's not enough to survive a family that already thinks our marriage looks convenient. We need enough that he can't talk his way out of the room. We went to Constance 3 days later, together, with the photograph and everything Earl had overheard secondhand from Tommy, who still wouldn't go on record but had at least stopped denying it happened. Constance listened without interrupting, her face doing the same unreadable thing it had done at the wedding, at the trust meeting, at every moment I'd tried and failed to read her. When we finished, she was quiet long enough that I started bracing for the worst. Then she opened a drawer in her study desk and pulled out a folder 6 months thick. I've had a forensic accountant looking at farm vendor payments since March, she said. Bluegrass Equine Logistics flagged in the first week. I couldn't move on it without more than a suspicious vendor name, not against Harlan's son, not without giving Grant time to bury it deeper before I had enough to survive the fight that would follow. I needed something that connected the money to an actual act, not just a paper trail a good lawyer could explain away. She looked at me, something almost like approval crossing her face. You just handed me the act. Something in my chest unclenched that had been clenched since the reporter's phone call in August. You never said anything. All those months. I thought. I know what you thought, Constance said. I let you think it, because Grant watches everyone in this family closely, and the one advantage I had was that he'd stopped bothering to watch me. I'm sorry for what that silence cost you in Weston. It was the only card I had, and I wasn't willing to spend it early. We built the rest of the case over the next 3 weeks, quietly, working nights so Grant would see nothing different in his days. Grant found out 4 days before the Ashwood Cup, though we never learned exactly how. I came back from the barn to find my laptop bag gone from the mood room, the external drive with 3 weeks of financial records and Tommy's recorded statement gone with it. The house hadn't been broken into. Someone with a key had simply walked in and taken exactly what mattered, nothing else. Constance called 20 minutes later, her voice tighter than I'd ever heard it. Her copy of the forensic report, the one she'd kept in her study for 6 months, was gone too. Grant had moved his petition to remove Weston as trustee up by 2 full weeks, filing it that same afternoon, citing ongoing instability and unresolved financial irregularities in Weston's management, the exact language of a man who knew precisely what evidence he'd just made disappear. We had 4 days and nothing left to show for 3 weeks of careful work. He's going to win, Weston said that night, the first time in 5 months I'd heard something close to defeat in his voice. He's going to stand in front of my father's oldest friends and use my own reputation, the one I let stand because it was easier than explaining myself, and there won't be anything left to prove otherwise. I thought about a spiral ledger in my back pocket, 4 generations of bishop women writing down what couldn't be faked no matter how good a liar you were. I thought about Tommy Reyes, 22 and terrified, who'd finally agreed to put his statement in writing 3 weeks ago. Did Tommy write his statement by hand or did we type it? I asked. Handwritten, Constance said slowly, understanding arriving in her voice before I'd finished explaining. He insisted on it, said typed things felt too easy to take back. Where's the original? Nobody had thought to make a copy of a handwritten page, but Tommy had. I kept mine, he said, when Earl reached him an hour later. Figured if I was finally going to be brave about something, I should probably keep proof I did it. We had 4 days, 1 photograph already committed to memory, and a 22-year-old's stubborn insistence on keeping a copy of his own courage. It would have to be enough. The Ashwood Cup drew 400 people to Callaway Farms every October, half of them there for the racing, the other half there for the particular Kentucky sport of watching old families conduct their business in public without ever raising their voices. Grant's petition was scheduled for reading before the trust's assembled family members at the Winner's Circle reception, timed for maximum audience. He wanted witnesses. He'd built his entire case on the idea that enough people watching would make removal feel inevitable before anyone had time to ask hard questions. I stood next to Weston in a green dress cut, for once for my own body, and watched Harlan Callaway read the petition language out loud to a crowd that had gone very quiet, very fast. Ongoing instability, Harlan read, financial irregularities inadequately explained, and a marriage of suspicious timing entered into under financial duress. Grant stood a few feet away, hands folded, wearing the exact expression he'd worn handing me champagne 5 months earlier. Above his head, if anyone else could have seen it, the reading hadn't changed once all year. Calculating 88%. Constance stepped forward before Harlan finished folding the paper back up. I'd like to enter something into the record as well, she said loud enough to carry. 6 months of forensic accounting on Bluegrass Equine Logistics, a vendor with no state registration and no verifiable business address, paid $41,000 over 3 years, every payment clearing 48 hours before a major race this farm's horses underperformed in. A murmur moved through the crowd like wind through a field. That proves nothing, Grant said, and his voice, for the first time all year, had an edge in it that hadn't been there before. A vendor discrepancy isn't a crime, You're reaching, Constance, and everyone here can see it. I have a photograph, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt, of a girth strap cut most of the way through, tagged with the date of my sister's riding accident, 4 days before my wedding. The same accident that put me in that dress instead of her. I let that land before I kept going. And I have a handwritten statement from a stable hand named Tommy Reyes, describing exactly how he was blackmailed into staging that cut, and exactly what he was told to say about Weston's temper in exchange for staying quiet about an insurance claim he helped falsify. Grant's mask slipped for exactly 1 second. I watched it happen, watched the calculating charm drop into something colder underneath, the true number finally showing itself where everyone could see it, not just me. You have a scared kid's word, Grant said, against mine. I have his handwriting, I said, and a copy he made himself, because he said typed things felt too easy to take back. The silence that followed lasted longer than the 11 minutes of my own wedding ceremony had. It was Harlan, in the end, who broke it, looking at his son with an expression I imagine he'd been avoiding for years. Grant, is any of this true? Grant didn't answer, he didn't have to. Some silences confirmed things faster than confessions ever could. The trust board voted that same evening, unanimously, to deny the petition and remove Grant from any standing role in Callaway Farms governance, effective immediately. Harlan Ashen promised the farm's council would refer the falsified insurance claim and the financial irregularities to the appropriate authorities before the week was out. Tommy Reyes, shaking but upright, told the truth one more time out loud, to his own relief more than anyone else's, and kept both his job and a debt to nobody but himself. Grant left the winner's circle alone, the crowd parting the way crowds part for people they've already, silently, finished with. 6 weeks later, the farm had mostly gone quiet again, the good kind, the kind that comes after a storm finishes rather than before one starts. Regan came for Sunday dinner now, a standing invitation neither of us had needed to say out loud twice. My mother came less often, and when she did, she no longer talked about seats at tables I hadn't earned. I hadn't needed to win an argument with her. I'd simply stopped attending the ones she tried to start. Tommy Rice still worked the West Barn, steadier every week, the kind of steady that comes from finally being believed. Constance and I had dinner together most Thursdays now, a habit neither of us had planned and both of us had come to depend on. I found Weston in the tack room on a Tuesday evening in November, cleaning a brittle he didn't need to clean. I read your ledger again, he said, not looking up. The whole thing this time, not just my page. End? Ranger's entry says he trusts exactly one person completely, and grudgingly tolerates the rest of us. He looked up, something soft and unguarded in his face I'd stopped being surprised by months ago. I was hoping you'd consider adding a second name to that line. I sat down on the overturned bucket next to him, the same one I'd sat on the night I found the strap, the same one he'd used with a traumatized horse until it finally believed the world had stopped being dangerous. I didn't have to earn a place at this table, I said, mostly to myself, testing how the words felt out loud for the first time. Not this one, not anymore. Weston set the bridle down and reached over, his thumb brushing once, gently, along my cheekbone, the same gesture I'd watched him use on a spooked horse's jaw 100 times before he ever used it on me. I didn't need the number to tell me what that meant anymore, I already knew. I was already loved, I had been for a while, I just finally stopped waiting to be told. Did she go far enough, or was she still too merciful? Comment justice if the ending was perfect. Comment harder if you wanted an even colder revenge. Your comments decide how ruthless the next ending should be. Like and subscribe if you want to be here for the next story.